Howdy there, folks. We have a rather interesting video to go over tonight. I need to pull up my studio on my other laptop here really quickly, and then we can dive right in here because I'm too stupid to remember to pull this up, you know, before going live so that I don't have to do it while I'm live. But, it's a learning process. So, ah, had to wet my whistle there for a second. Sorry about that, folks. There is a YouTube channel. This is somebody who was on, I think it was what's the channel? AMC, I think it was. Freak Show was the name of the show, I believe. This person's name is Morgue. I'm going to use he or they in terms of the pronouns for this person. When I tag them on YouTube, like for the title of this video, it came up Mr. Morgue Official. So my assumption is going to be that they prefer he, him, or he, they pronouns. So those are the pronouns that I will be using. You may be wondering, why are you questioning pronoun usage? You'll see when I bring the video up. But here, let me turn the brightness down on my laptop a little bit so there's not so much glare in my glasses. This is an individual that pushes. I don't actually know if it's something they developed on their own or if it's something that maybe they got from somebody else, but it's something called Hyperionism. And it's very much an idealist, philosophically idealist perspective on reality. I'm not going to go too far into it because it's not really the topic of this particular stream. But this individual, Morgue, has made numerous videos pushing a lot of what I would personally characterize as pseudoscience. Pseudoscience and misinformation. Now, principle of charity, I'm not going to sit here and assume that it's being done purposefully or that this person is saying things that they know are not actually true. I am going to take the assumption that this person is genuine about what they believe, but at the same time, I'm going to call out the things that they're saying for what I see them as, which is just blatant pseudoscience. And in this particular video that we'll be covering here tonight, they're talking about consciousness and quantum mechanics and the ways in which they may be connected. So let's get this video brought up. Let's go full screen and let's jump right in.
Today, we're talking about the mystery of quantum mechanics and consciousness and their solution. Because quantum mechanics and consciousness are two of the biggest areas that science cannot explain. And what we're going to see is that one of the reasons why these two areas cannot be explained by science is because they share a commonality between them. We're going to see that the problem that arises, which makes science unable to be able to explain quantum mechanics and consciousness, deals with their materialist and empiricist dogmatic bias. That we can solve these problems actually quite easily by seeing that they actually relate to each other. Now, some scientists are beginning to think that, hey, maybe this is a possibility, and they have this idea of something called quantum consciousness. So we're going to take a look at that and see if that's true or if it's not true. And ultimately, we're going to see that even though physics is starting to get closer, some are even starting to adopt the panpsychist idea, they're still pretty far from the mark. So we're going to explain all the problems with quantum mechanics and as well get into the problems with consciousness and how to solve them. And this is extremely important if you're well versed in quantum mechanics or you've never heard of quantum mechanics.
Well versed in quantum mechanics. Well, I'm versed in quantum mechanics. Well versed, there's going to be a matter of debate between who you ask, whether or not they know me or what they think of me, but I'm certainly versed. I did want to comment, though, while I can here, on the idea of quantum consciousness. It's not really something that's... So let me first say that the term quantum consciousness is probably going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And the thing that needs to be said is that in terms of like neuroscience or physics or neurology or anything like that, quantum consciousness isn't a term that you're really going to hear many professionals use. They don't see much of a crossover between these two areas. The brain is what's often referred to as too warm, too wet, and too loud to be largely governed by quantum mechanics, though there is naturally quantum mechanical processes occurring in the brain. Whether there's any whether any of those processes have any major macro scale effect on our fundamental cognitive processes is something that could potentially be the case, but probably isn't. So quantum consciousness is itself a rather loaded term, and it isn't it isn't a term that that a lot of professionals are going to be using. So I did want to say that quickly. Let us continue.
Before.
He started calling the living room the home theater once we put the center.
Sorry,
We have
folks,
a
I
dimmer
do
so we
not
can bring down the
have
lights a little bit.
YouTube Premium.
And if you've never
Sorry
heard of
about
quantum
that.
mechanics before, please watch this video and do some research on quantum mechanics in general.
Yeah, I've never heard of quantum mechanics before. What is that? It sounds very interesting. I'd be very interested to hear more about this quantum mechanics you speak of.
I did a poll on my
So, like, can they work on my car? Are they able to work on my car? Can a quantum mechanic work on my car? That would be cool. Like, do they do it with like special technology or something? Yeah, I have never heard of this quantum mechanics. I am so riveted for this particular discussion.
social media. If people have heard or know what quantum mechanics is, 60% said yes and 40% said no. And that's just crazy to me that that 40% just don't know what quantum mechanics is. This is incredibly important. Quantum mechanics is almost...
If you think 40% of your audience not knowing what quantum mechanics is surprising, don't poll the average public.
Is it over 100 years? It's either over 100 years or almost 100 years old at this point. Close to...
It's over 100 years. It's about 100 and, depending on where you define the start of quantum mechanics, anywhere between about 107 to like 115 years old.
To a century, and it obliterates the idea that we live in a material world. So if you haven't heard of quantum mechanics, please do some research. Watch this video. We're going to get into it, and we're going to look at the solutions to quantum mechanics and consciousness. It's going to be good. Let's get started. So let's jump right into this article, and then I will explain what's going on as we go along. Now, this article is from mindmatters.ai. Very cool website. It says, can quantum physics, neuroscience merge as quantum consciousness? And this is going to be very important because, as we said, quantum mechanics and consciousness are two areas that science cannot explain. And we're going to see the reason.
What? This is weird when people make statements about like large branches of science and claim that, oh, well, science can't explain this explicative and predictive methodology in science. I just don't understand what this means. Science can't explain quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is an explanation. I don't know what this means. Why do people say this? I'm so yeah, what if you mean that like we don't really have a strongly developed ontological understanding of a lot of what quantum mechanics tells us, I can grant that, but that's just more of a philosophical issue. And it is one that I think we're seeing some more of the physicists starting to pay attention to and potentially work on, and hopefully we can get solutions to it. Potentially solving quantum gravity, which I certainly think will happen in my lifetime, will lead us down that path, to finding the proper foundation for quantum mechanics. But when people say things like, oh, well, science can't explain, quantum mechanics, science can't explain neuroscience, science can't explain evolution, all these things that are themselves scientific explanations, I'm absolutely lost. It just makes no sense to me.
And why they can't explain these two areas is because they have a commonality between them, and this commonality cannot be solved by the materialist paradigm. That is the paradigm, the position taken by the vast majority of science, which says that this world is physical / material, and that only. And we're going to see that this is at the heart.
So I do want to clarify really quickly that what Morgue means here when he says materialism is like physicalism or even naturalism. And I don't really want to use the word conflating because it makes it sound like what he's doing is wrong. He's sort of, well, I guess technically conflating those three terms, but it's not that it's wrong to do so. That's often done, especially in a colloquial sense. In terms of naturalism and physicalism, I think that those terms are at least effectively synonymous. But I do think both terms, physicalism and naturalism, are in a there's more of a distinction between those two terms with materialism than there is between physicalism and naturalism, where materialism is often defined as something like all of what reality is reduces to matter and its interactions. But the thing is if you were to present that to like a theoretical physicist, they would probably say, well, that isn't particularly true. We know obviously that there is a a quantum reality that is where matter emerges from, so we can go below the level of matter and its interactions, which is why I often say I am not a materialist. If we take materialism at least simpliciter, where it's just all of reality is reducible to matter and its interactions, and we know that's false. We can go to a level below matter, but within this video, I believe Morgue is referring to more of physicalism or naturalism.
Part of why quantum physics and consciousness cannot be solved. So let's just go continue here. So physicist and astronomer Marcelo Gleiser offers some thoughts as to the light that quantum mechanics, as opposed to classical physics, can shed on consciousness. The problem, he thinks, is that both quantum mechanics and consciousness are mysteries. Adding two mysteries together doesn't produce simple answers. Well, I mean, that's true, but we're going to look at the foundation of these and discover that they aren't actually mysterious.
Yeah, but the thing is, saying that because two things share a similar property, i.e., maybe they're like, if I don't know if I want to use, I'm going to use the word ethereal and science. Like they're just weird areas of science. We don't really know all that much about them, at least in some sense. Therefore, those two areas of science must be related is fallacious. It doesn't follow that because they would share that property, I guess you could say, that therefore that there's a relation between them. And that seems to be a frequent argument you hear from a lot of especially idealists, is this notion that because there's this weirdness in quantum mechanics and about quantum mechanics rather, and there's this weirdness about consciousness that, well, perhaps they're both connected. And I just that just doesn't follow.
Mysterious at all. They're only mysterious because you're operating inside a paradigm that does not include the answer to your mystery. So it's going to seem mysterious. What we're going to find out is that ultimately the answer to quantum mechanics and consciousness rely on the ontology of mind. That is, mind being real, not derivative of matter. So if you are in a materialist paradigm that says mind.
So as you can see, we have an idealist perspective being presented here, that matter and its interactions is derivative of mind, not the other way around, which is, I think that's more of like a hard idealism, but that's still that is an idealist perspective. And more ads.
Is
fucking
not
beautiful.
Is 391,434 square
and is a derivative matter.
Hey guys, I have an idea. What if we started our own platform that's like exactly like YouTube, except it's not called YouTube and it's not YouTube, And what we do is we allow people to create their own content and post it on this platform. But then what we'll do is we'll allow corporations to pay us, nominal sums of money to run, very short ads on our videos. And then what we'll do after we do that is what we see, and this is the important part here. What we'll do after that then is we'll offer the ability to use our platform without the ads, but just charge people money for that. And then here's where I need you guys to bear with me. Bear with me on this, please. After that, what we do is we saturate the platform in advertisement in an effort to force our platform users to purchase the ad-free version, thereby giving us money, while at the same time we're running ads and making money that way. Wouldn't that just be great, guys, if we did something like that? Wouldn't that just be the greatest fucking thing ever? Don't you think people would fucking love that? Don't you think that would just fucking sparkle with everybody if we did something like that?
Consciousness and quantum mechanics are going to seem like a mystery because the answer to your mystery lies outside of your paradigm. You can imagine the paradigm is sort of being a circle. You're here inside your circle. The answer to something is outside of your circle. You'll never be able to get the answer because it is outside the walls, the dogmatic prison.
But the thing is that if one presupposes, and I suppose with respect to this particular argument, one would, in a sense, be presupposing that mind is physical. But if one does so, and I think that there are justificatory reasons for that, for doing so, if one does so, I would argue then that you wouldn't be capable of arguing that the explanation, if you're using mind as the explanation, lies outside of the paradigm that is used to explain things. Because the paradigm that is used is that explanations are natural and physical and mechanistic, and maybe not necessarily deterministic, but they are natural, physical, and mechanistic in nature and procedural. So if somebody proposes that mind is a part of that, and you're using mind to explain that, then and that's why those who are turning to something like what Morgue is pushing here do turn more to a panpsychism rather than an idealism, because you can be a panpsychist and be a naturalist or a physicalist. Just argue that consciousness is a natural thing. It's a physical thing. I mean, and there are panpsychists that do that. I don't personally take to a panpsychist view, but if I did, I would still retain my physicalist and naturalist perspective
that you have built for yourself. So this is a quote. It says, "The truth is that despite the tremendous success of quantum physics when it comes to its applications, the digital and nuclear technologies that define much of modern life, its interpretation remains uncertain, a target of heated debate among physicists. We know how to use quantum physics, but we don't know what it is telling us about the nature of reality."
And yeah, this is just referring to quantum foundations. The idea that we epistemically, we can garner a knowledge about reality through what we call quantum mechanics. We can use it as a framework. We can use it, even phenomenologically to derive certain aspects about how nature behaves. But we don't really have much in the way of an ontological description of what reality is at this level. Some would postulate that, well, such a question is meaningless. Some would postulate that, well, it may not be meaningless, but I don't really care about it. And some would say that it's going to depend on your particular foundational interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I think there is some truth to that. And right now, there's several different frameworks through which quantum mechanics could be interpreted. So it's really hard to pin down exactly which one. I mean, you can reproduce the effects that we see, and we measure through a variety of different interpretations. So we can't really pin down which one is correct. Me personally, I take to Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics, but that's just me. Other people take to different particular interpretations. But I just wanted to clarify that that's all that's being said by this particular individual here. I did skim over this article before this, and it seems that largely a lot of it was taken out of context, but I'm not here to discuss particularly that article.
Another reason why that I like to take a look at these articles from, people that are mainstream thinkers, mainstream scientists, is because I say a lot of things that people think are controversial or woo-woo. So I often say,
Morgue, I just want to let you know that's because you know, you do say things that are kind of woo-woo, you know? So that's why people tell you that you say things that are kind of woo-woo. That's how that works. Just like, you know, people bitch that, oh well, such and such said that I said something racist, and it's like, yeah, it's because you did. Yeah.
that science does not know what reality is. It is only useful at being a tool to model reality, to make predictions about reality. And a useful tool is not the same thing as an explanation. Check out my video on the difference between explanation and description if you want more info on that. But
Okay, I would like to stop there because I actually was going through Morgue's channel. I saw that video, and I am probably going to do a response to that one too. So what Morgue has presented here at least sounds something along the lines of what is often referred to as scientific instrumentalism, where it states that our scientific theories and our scientific models are just merely sort of, you know, epistemic instruments, I guess you could say, for understanding aspects of how reality behaves, but they don't really give us any ontological information about what reality is. Whereas somebody who's a scientific realist would say, no, our theories and our models do. What they're telling us is what reality is and how it behaves fundamentally. They're not just sort of conventional, you know, tools to help us understand, you know, a little bit about reality. They're telling us the fundamental nature of it. And these are two different views in the philosophy of science. The vast majority of professional scientists are scientific realists. I think the majority of philosophers are also scientific realists. But yeah, what Morgue is pushing or is talking about here is more of a scientific instrumentalist view.
in a nutshell, what that means is that if you make a map of something, that map can be very helpful for navigating, but the map doesn't explain what the thing is that it's mapping. So a map of the city will be very good at using it to navigate the city, but the map doesn't say what a city is, its makeup, its properties, its essence, its ontology. So science is the same thing. It can make useful predictions. It can model things. It's like a map, but it does not and cannot explain what things are. And people think, oh, wow, that's so, you know, people think that that's very controversial. And I like to just point out, this isn't even controversial. This is, you know, if you start to take high level physics, not even high level physics. If you take physics, they will teach you this. And this is a quote right here by Marcelo Gleiser.
I don't believe I've never actually been to university or a college and taken courses in physics, but I have watched lectures in a variety of different courses in physics from a few different prestigious universities. And I can't say that any of them really talk about scientific realism or scientific instrumentalism, let alone push either one of those. So I would have to say that, at least from my perspective, I disagree. And in all honesty, the nature of a lot of the lectures that I have watched, it seems that a lot of what they talk about presupposes a scientific realist perspective. That this is what nature is. This is how nature behaves. It's not just a description of something we don't know anything about and can't, potentially. It's telling us, yes, this is what reality is. This is how it behaves. They don't really outright say it, but that seems to be the framework from which they work.
In saying this, that we've had tremendous success with quantum physics when it comes to its applications, how it is used in digital and nuclear technologies, but what it is uncertain. We don't know what it's telling us about the nature of reality. So first of all, right off the bat, keep that in mind. All right. This is not a controversial idea. This is
Just that's not actually entirely wrong, but just to add some context, quantum mechanics as it stands today doesn't tell us fully what reality is, but large aspects of it do tell us what reality is. We've got, the violation of Bell's inequalities. We know reality is fundamentally non-local. We've got the violation of Leggett's inequalities and the Leggett-Garg inequalities. We know reality is fundamentally non-real, and that's non-real in a sense of physics, not in a sense of philosophy or metaphysics. And then we've got the Koch-Specker theorem. So we know that reality fundamentally is non-contextual, that there's almost a relational aspect to how you measure things, which is part of the reason I hold to a relational quantum mechanics view as proposed by Carlo Rovelli in the late 90s. So there are things that we know about reality through quantum mechanics that tell us this is the way that reality behaves. We know that quantum fields are a fundamental aspect and a physical objective property of reality, but we don't fully understand largely a broad context in which we can understand all of these various aspects of quantum mechanics. And that's where quantum foundations comes into play. And I would argue, at least at this point, it's a little bit more philosophical than it is physical, but they're still both intrinsically connected when discussing this particular subject.
Mainstream that science does not know.
So I got my dad this weird new tool for Christmas,
Jesus.
and at first he thought it looked kind of
What quantum physics tells us about reality, which in essence means they don't know what reality is, because quantum mechanics has to do with the foundation property, the foundational properties of matter, what matter is. So, which means science doesn't know what matter is.
Well, I mean, it does. Matter is an emergent property resulting from the ways in which quantum fields, interact either with themselves or with each other. It's not matter is not a fundamental aspect of reality. There, you can go more fundamental than that, but to say that we don't, or that scientists don't know what it is, I don't view that as being correct. I wouldn't say that's a correct way of looking of looking at it. I don't think most theoretical physicists or nuclear physicists or particle physicists would agree with that either. We do know what matter is.
So it's really scientific materialism is so littered with logical holes. For example, they are materialists. They claim that all reality is matter, yet they cannot define what matter is. They don't know what.
Yeah, they don't. That's not something they say. Anyway,
matter is. So they are a system that doesn't know what it is. Anyway, so keep that in mind. Always important to keep in mind that scientific materialism is not a rationalist system. That's a big misconception, because people who are atheists or follow scientism love to say, oh, reason, reason, reason. But remember, always remember, scientific materialism, the prevailing scientific establishment is not rationalist, it's empiricist. And because it's an empirical system, that means that reason is in a subordinate.
Again, some clarification. Modern science is methodologically empiricist, not philosophically empiricist.
Position that reason is used, but only as a secondary character, kind of like the sidekick. It's not the star of the show. It's not the main tool used. The main epistemological tool of science is empiricism, which relies on the senses.
Okay, I'm so confused. Oh, but empiricism itself assumes a validity to reason, to the human cognitive processes. So science presupposes that, and again, science is what we'd call methodologically empiricist. It isn't philosophically or metaphysically empiricist. Science is a system that is built around the concept of understanding things empirically, whereas there are other methods of human intellectual thought that might not be empiricist, like, say, moral philosophy and ethics and epistemology and things of that nature, mathematics even. So I don't know what it means to say that reason is secondary to science. Reason, or rather, science is founded on reason, on the use of reason. It's not explicitly and exclusively reason that is being used.
Then the content gathered by sensory data, reason is then applied to that. And this leads to a huge number of logical fallacies because sense data can be very, very wrong. So it's an empirical system, not a rationalist system.
Yeah, but when we say empirical and we talk about sense data, we don't mean literally only through the specific classical human senses. Microscopes, telescopes, the Large Hadron Collider, laser interferometers for detecting gravitational waves, all of these things are empirical means of understanding aspects of reality, because they can tell us things that we can understand through more than just sitting down and thinking about it. We can go out into the world and find it and see it and test for it and understand it without just sort of thinking through it and reasoning through it. That's really what it means to be empirical. And so when you say we did just through the senses, well, when it comes to science, no, that's not entirely true. We use a variety of different tools and devices that allow us to understand things that aren't reliant on merely our intuitions or our senses, and oftentimes correct for the very misconceptions that they may deliver that you are mentioning.
Rationalist system epistemologically says that reason is what is used to know reality, first and foremost. So if our senses tell us something that we know is not rational, we can know that our senses are somehow deceiving us, because our senses can be deceived all the time. Scientists, however, do not follow this law. So if their empirical observations conflict with reason.
What are you talking about? Wait, but that's how scientists make predictions. I mean, if something doesn't rationally fit or reasonably fit in a theory or something like that, it's probably not going to be included or considered. If something logically follows from some, or mathematically follows from some scientific theory or model that's proposed, and numerous aspects of that model have been confirmed, but that one hasn't, it will probably be assumed to be true. Of course, processes of reason and rationality are utilized in science all the time.
Reason, they will approve illogical conclusions. So they are not on the side of logic and reason, they are on the side of empiricism. Really important to remember that. And again, this is not controversial.
One more time, just for the audience's sake, just for educational purposes. Empiricism as an ideology is going to be based on ideas of reason and rationality. It's going to presuppose, logical truths, logical axioms, mathematical axioms, deductive processes, inductive processes, and the validity or cogency of all of these systems of thought. So I'm a little confused. Yeah.
This is not me just making things up. This is just how it is. If you take a course, let's say the philosophy of science, you will be taught this. This is not controversial. It's not well known because people don't study, but it's true and not controversial. So,
well, I mean, in the sense that there are different ideologies, I guess you could say, that one can adhere to. There's a lot. Wow, I'm really drawing a blank on this. Logical positivism, empiricism, verificationism. What's the other one? There's one more I'm missing. There's a lot of different ways that we can talk about the nature of truth and knowledge and justification and means of acquiring it. And that's going to be more in the realm of epistemology. And the methodologies of science do presuppose a particular epistemological framework. But the thing about science is it's not like it excludes the other ones as being useless, and they don't work at all and nobody should ever use them. It's saying that science is built around specifically these epistemological frameworks, and things like empiricism or verificationism are going to be large aspects of that. That's the nature of science.
Okay, so Marcelo Gleiser is saying we don't know what quantum mechanics is or is telling us about reality. We can use it as a tool for technology, but we don't know what it is, and we don't know what it's telling us about reality.
You can always count on your Touchstone Energy Cooperative to power every moment of your day.
It did not do this the first time when I skipped.
And if you don't know what quantum
video.
mechanics is, please go take a look real quick. Very quickly,
insane.
in a nutshell, quantum mechanics basically says when you start looking at matter very closely, it no longer behaves like matter. It starts to behave like waves and has all these properties that conflict with definitions of matter.
I mean, that's a very rough definition of quantum mechanics. But to be more specific, you could say that quantum mechanics is just a mathematical framework that is largely statistical in nature, that is utilized for describing the behaviors, the actions, the motion of objects at a particular scale of reality that would be extraordinarily small compared to the scale that we are used to experiencing, what we often refer to as the quantum scale of reality. And that the conclusions of the equations, as far as we can understand, do gives what are oftentimes understood as being non-intuitive conclusions. There are reasons for that. I'm not going to go off on a tangent about them now, but yeah, the thing is, it's just some people will try to define quantum mechanics as being this mysterious thing that nobody really understands. No.
No longer behave like classical atoms or classical particles. They start to exhibit quantum properties, which are wave-like in nature. However, it's completely unknown as to what these waves are because these waves are non-physical. The wave function that they follow.
What? Wait, hold on. These waves are not non-physical. So, okay. So first off, there's waves in the sense of a wave function, which is a statistical distribution of a set of outcomes for an observable. And this wave function corresponds to essentially a probabilistic wave of energy that is propagating through a quantum field. And if you can take a quantum field and if you can perturb or sort of jiggle it energetically enough, you will start to see a thing that we would call a particle. That's what. So when we know what these waves are, they're largely just mathematical tools that allow us to understand the statistical nature of reality. But you could also say that there's distributions of energy through a quantum field or through points in something that occupies all of space, which is what we mean when we say field. Yes, we know what these waves are.
Flow is not a physical wave. So everything starts to break down when you get to the quantum mechanical level. Everything that classical physics tells you breaks down at the quantum mechanical level. Scientists have no idea what this is, what's going on, because matter no longer behaves like matter. It starts to be.
Yes, they do. We know quite well what's going on because we have equations which can describe it. See, this is the thing. People talk about quantum mechanics as if like nobody even knows what it's telling us or what's going on, and it's like, okay, then what do you make of the equations which tell us what's going on? Like we use these equations all the time. They tell us what's going on. We know what's happening. It's not like scientists are just like scrambling to figure out what all this is and what all this means and have no idea how to use it or what it's telling us. That this is not a thing that's true about quantum mechanics. There are very well-defined equations. We might only be able to perturb them and approximate solutions, but we are still capable of deriving quite accurate solutions that hold in a variety of different experiments. And we know that they are reliable, they're verifiable, they're consistent. I mean, the aspects of quantum field theory are some of the most confirmed aspects of reality. So yes, we know what's going on here.
Behave like waves, and not waves of matter, waves of they don't know. And precisely the reason why they don't know is because the answer, which is mind, as we'll see, is outside of their paradigm. As we said, we showed that, I gave the example of that circle. The answer is outside of their allowed possibilities. So Glacier
no
is saying,
iron
we don't know what
charioteer.
quantum
This
mechanics
person
is.
is not a
We don't know
trained
what it's telling us
scientist
about
or
reality.
physicist.
And it's the same thing with the mind. In a nutshell, the issue here is that tagging neuronal activity is the easy part of the task. The hard part is understanding how active neurons conspire to create the sense of who we are. That is translating bioelectrical activity and blood flow into self-awareness. And that's another big thing when it comes to the mind. Sure, scientists can measure neuronal activity. They can measure electrical impulses. They can measure bioelectrical activity and blood flow. But that says nothing about self-awareness.
This is a question that gets a little hairy, because if you were to go and ask a neurologist or a neuroscientist, can we understand what consciousness is? They're going to tell you, to a large extent, yes. We don't fully understand it. We don't fully understand how the brain integrates to create it, but we do have a large understanding, and we are able to form viable and valid hypotheses that give us accurate and meaningful descriptions for how it likely or probably arises and occurs, and where certain aspects of our cognitive reasoning, our thought processes, our decision making, what have you, we can even hone down to what particular aspects of the brain, whether they be a singular aspect or one or a couple of aspects operating in tandem. Largely, they can hone in on a lot of that stuff, and they can do it by observing the activity of these areas, the blood flow, which is going to indicate increased activity. We can use reports from the patients as they're being experimented on. A lot of these things to determine in an objective sense what's going on in the brain and how consciousness may arise rather out of how the brain interfaces with itself and the reality into which we're submerged. And there's really only one physicist that I can tolerate commenting on neuroscience and philosophy of mind, and that's Sean Carroll. When other physicists do it, they get a little sloppy, and it can be a little irritating. And that's kind of something I got from this article here when I was reading it, is that this guy's a physicist talking about neuroscience. He's getting a little sloppy.
And it's a category error to think that it does say something about self-awareness. Just because things are correlated, just because certain brain states may correlate to certain mental states, does not mean that those brain states cause those mental states. That's a post hoc ergo propter hoc illogical.
This assumes that there's a duality between brain states and mental states. Some people would reject that there's even a duality. They would just say that there's the brain, there's what it does, and out of that emerges what we are and our consciousness. That there isn't sort of this duality, that there's brain states and then there's mental states, and do brain states cause mental states, or is there only a correlation? Maybe there's not even two different types of states. Maybe there's just one state, and that's that. So, I mean, a lot of this is deep in philosophy of mind, and there's a lot of this that is still up for debate. There's a lot of people who have a variety of different ideas about these things. Me, personally, I'm what you would consider maybe an illusionist about the idea of mental states or qualia experience. I don't think that there's like a red that exists in an object and then like a red that you experience when you look at the object, that there's two different reds. I think there's just one red and that you're capable of having an experience of it. And you can communicate that and qualify that and quantify that in a variety of different ways.
Fallacy, logical fallacy. And
Hi, YouTube.
Jesus fucking Christ. At least they're letting me skip them all, huh? Because they're coming every 5 fucking minutes.
Main thing to take away from this is that essentially, just like physicists, scientists cannot explain what quantum physics is and what it says about reality, neither can they understand or explain what the mind is or what consciousness is. They can model the brain, but that is not the same thing as explaining how it is that you can have the subjective experience of what it is like to be you.
How do we know that there is a what it is like? What if that's not just what if that's just not a thing? What if the whole concept of what it's like just doesn't make sense? Which is something that I would probably take to myself. But yeah, this whole this sort of goes back to that one question that was posed. What's it like to be a bat, and how does it differ from being a human?
The brain does not explain that. So, indeed, for example, in a recent and again, this is not controversial. You go take a philosophy of science course when I have not yet said anything that falls outside of what is known conventionally. So,
except that when you say that that nobody can explain either quantum mechanics or consciousness, because those two claims would be rejected by the vast majority of professionals in those relevant fields.
Indeed, for example, in a recent discussion, neuropsychologist Mark Solms and neurosurgeon Michael Egnor agreed that while neuroscientists tend to see the prefrontal cortex of the human brain as the seat of consciousness.
Michael Egnor? Did they really just say Michael Egnor, that guy? Oh, man. I mean, I know he's a legitimate neuroscientist, but still, that's... okay, that tells me a lot. Michael Egnor. What in the fuck?
Clinical experience points to portions of the brainstem. But where does that leave us? Vertebrates of widely varying degrees of intelligence and of self-awareness have brainstems. Okay, so let me now start to dive into the answer of these things. Because we're going to start getting into... All right, so let's start here. First of all, anyone who follows my videos know that I have a big gripe with how Carolyn Gray says, are you saying that matter cannot exist without consciousness? I'll get to that in a moment. Because I'm about to explain. This goes with what you asked. Okay. So I have a big problem with science's misuse of the word consciousness. So consciousness, when scientists say consciousness, what they usually mean is sentience. They constantly...
No. Sentience is different than consciousness. Sentience is a little bit higher than consciousness.
In almost every article, use the word consciousness incorrectly when they mean sentience. Sentience is awareness. Consciousness is...
Sentience is awareness of like feelings, emotions, and things of that nature. The aspects of experience that really allow you to be, say, like a moral agent. That's sentience. Consciousness is just what we can amount to some level of awareness, oftentimes, of the self.
Being aware that one is aware. It's a higher form of mind. And it is a
No, no, no. Sentience is higher. Sentience is higher on the list than consciousness is. I mean, if you don't believe me, just go look it up. Sentience is up higher than consciousness.
complex form of mind that allows for self-reference and metacognition. So, for example, an animal is sentient. There is a what it is like to be a dog. The dog is hungry, the dog is happy, the dog is sad, and it has all these experiences. The dog is aware. But the dog is not conscious in that it's not aware that it is aware. There's a big difference because
Yeah, no, both of those would be false. A dog is conscious. Dogs are also I mean, they're self-aware. Dogs are also slightly sentient. They're not as sentient as, say, a human being is, but dogs are still sentient, considered sentient beings. So yeah, it's not even that it's backwards. It's just not correct. Sentience again is like a higher level awareness of emotions and feelings and things of that nature. Such that one can be a moral agent to some degree, and consciousness would just be a general awareness of oneself and one's surroundings, and potentially even an ability to differentiate between those.
when you are aware that you are aware, this develops a sense of I, which allows one to transcend the current moment and exist in possibility space. What that means by transcending the current moment is that it means you can think of possible futures. For example, thinking of possible futures means, perhaps at 12 o'clock tonight, I will have a midnight snack, or perhaps later on, I want to go see a movie. Are
we talking about goal setting? We have a pretty good idea of how goal setting originated evolutionarily, why it developed as a trait in our brains, and what aspects of our brain give rise to it. I don't know anything about it off the top of my head, except that I know that there's a lot of literature on the idea of goal setting, that humans have this goal setting, this ability to predict the future and plan for it. Is often referred to as goal setting, our ability to set goals and examine the future with respect to where we're at now, and set a variety of goals and things like that. Yeah, that's explained fairly well in terms of the brain, what the brain does, and the particular areas of the brain that may lead to that particular behavior, and the evolutionary reasons as to why we may have that kind of behavior. That's not something new to neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists.
thinking about future possibilities rather than just being in the current moment. You are transcending the current moment and living in a possibility space. You can also transcend the current moment by pulling the past, by pulling in memories, by consciously bringing in memories. Oh, remember that time when I, went to the supermarket and I accidentally got peas instead of grapes. I don't know why you do that, but that's something that I don't know why this is the first thing that came to my head. Kind of weird, but you see what I mean. You are consciousness.
I think that's retrospection. I believe it is. Yeah, retrospection is also another thing that a lot of the behavioral psychologists and neuroscientists think they might have nailed down fairly, relatively decently in terms of why we have it, in terms of our biology, evolutionary processes, the advantages it may have served, and also the areas of the brain that it likely arises from. We can do this with the majority of aspects of human cognitive processes and thought processes and what have you, from how we form and develop beliefs and desires and things of that nature, to how we perceive colors and sounds and tastes and textures and a variety of those things, to things like goal setting, introspection, retrospection, emotion. All of these things, we can measure them in the brain. We know, and I'm not saying like to the fullest extent or to a complete extent, but to a relatively accurate and verifiable extent, we can measure all of these things in the brain. We know what part or parts of the brain are involved in it. We know at least largely why these things developed from an evolutionary or a biological standpoint. We understand their importance to our survival, and we can define how, when you put them all together, you can get what we are conscious. That this idea that consciousness is ethereal and esoteric and unexplained, and nobody really knows anything about it, is honestly not supported by the empirical literature in the field of neuroscience.
Is a high and complex form of mind that allows one to be aware that they are aware, engage in advanced forms of metacognition that develops a sense of I, allows one to transcend the current moment, live in a space that allows for possible futures, and to be able to bring in the past, such as explicit conscious retrieval of memory. In a nutshell, 9 times out of 10, when you're reading a scientific article talking about the nature of reality or quantum mechanics or panpsychism, and they say consciousness, they're using it wrong. They mean sentience. And any psychologist will tell you this. I mean, not any psychologist, but any psychologist that's
most wouldn't.
worth their salt will
No.
tell you that this is the case.
No.
So,
my proteges, Stella and Victor, will illustrate my writings and theories.
I'm gonna freak the fuck out.
let's now start to dive into some of the answers here.
Sweet.
Scientific materialism is a materialist paradigm. And what this means, as I said, is that they believe that all reality is material and that mind is derivative of matter. So now in Hyperianism, we have the opposite stance. It is a rationalist idealist system, which means that all reality is mind and that matter is derivative of mind. It's the complete opposite stance. Not necessarily that matter is a derivative of consciousness, but that it is a derivative of mind. Because remember, consciousness is a...
So wait, what is mind? Because a lot of people would ultimately reduce mind to the idea that there's that this idea of consciousness and sentience, awareness of oneself, of one's surroundings, and an ability to differentiate between them, an ability to feel and to have emotion, and thereby, all the things that we have morality and ethics that result out of that. But if that's not what you mean by mind, Morgue, then I don't know what you mean.
a complex form of mind that evolves down the road. But mind itself is the underlying component that gives rise to matter. This is...
How does it do that? This is the one thing about this view. How does mind give rise to matter? What's the mechanism? If there isn't one, then why should I believe it's a thing that happens?
why, once you start getting into the quantum mechanical territory and you start looking very closely at material particles, they no longer start to behave like material particles. Rather, they start exhibiting wave-like behavior.
That's because fundamental particles, elementary particles, aren't particles. They are waves in quantum fields. It's just that we can perturb those fields to the point that they're so energetic, about a point that we do arbitrarily pick in the field, that we can call that a particle. That's it. That's that.
That is not material. Why? This is because matter in our system is founded on mind. So this wave-like behavior is mind. Once we start bringing mind into the picture, the mysteries of quantum mechanics are no longer mysterious. These mysteries of quantum mechanics and consciousness and mind are only mysterious if you take a materialist position. Because now the answer is no longer outside of our paradigm, it's perfectly within our paradigm. We have broken down the imprisoning dogmatic walls with reason, which allows for us to find the answer to our question.
But the answer was in the paradigm the whole time. If the paradigm is a physicalist or a naturalist perspective, and one takes mind to be natural, you could still argue that it's fundamental to reality. It's just itself a natural thing or a physical thing, and matter emerges out of it. Most people would consider that at least something along the lines of a panpsychist view, but that would be more closely, I think, more close to an idealist perspective. And there are obvious differences between idealism and panpsychism, but the idea that you can't take a physicalist or a naturalist perspective and explain aspects of quantum mechanics and fundamental physics, I think it's just not true.
Now, if you're new to my channel, you're wondering like, well, how do we know that reality is mind? We show rationally and mathematically how we can know this. Well, I'm going to, this video would be hours long if I got into that now, because we want to talk about quantum mechanics specifically. But just know that in our system, reality is founded on mind. And if you want to know why, like what is the reason for this, how do we know this, check out my other videos. I've done tons of videos on this. But this is where Hyperianism begins. Reality is ultimately mind. And we define mind through mathematics, rigorous mathematics, beginning with the source formula and the principle of sufficient reason.
But we can define physical things through mathematics as well. Obviously, that's what physics is. So it seems to me that if we can define mind mathematically, if we can quantify it in what I would presume Morgue would say an objective sense that is concrete, how is it not a physical thing?
And so in essence, what this means is we know what is mind. Mind is basically living mathematics, mathematics as frequency in motion. It's still a structure of mental relationships. And by mental, we mean it doesn't have any sort of physical.
Oh, okay. So Iron Charioteer asks, can you explain what the PSR is? So yeah, I don't think Morgue really said it. So the PSR stands for the Principle of Sufficient Reason, which essentially states that there must be a sufficient reason or explanation for why anything is, or why it is the way that it is. And this is often a principle that is invoked when theists of a variety of sorts use the contingency argument that because everything has to have some sort of explanation for its being, and the universe is a thing which has being, then there must be an explanation for why the universe even exists at all. But one can reject, and I believe that the 2020 Phil survey has shown that most philosophers reject the principle of sufficient reason. That there are things that may just have no explanation at all, that they just are sort of either brute facts or brute contingencies, as it's often said.
Physical extension. And ultimately, matter is derived from mind, meaning that matter is a kind of illusion and ultimately breaks down to mind, which is why in quantum mechanics, when we start looking very, very closely at material particles, we see that they are no longer material and they begin to exhibit wave-like properties, which is mental properties, properties of mind. And how does this happen? This happens via a Fourier transform. If anyone is familiar with Fourier mathematics, mind is defined as frequency functions. We can transform frequency functions into space-time functions, functions of space and time, which in a nutshell means...
What? There's nothing about like Fourier transforms, Laplace transforms, anything like that in mathematics that even talks about mind. Mind isn't even a factor. A Fourier transform is a way of transforming between two different domains, oftentimes the time and the frequency domain. But in something like quantum mechanics, you would use a Fourier transform to transform between, say, the position space and the momentum space. And what happens is the more you localize around some value in the position space, the less you are localized around the value in the momentum space, and vice versa. And so this is useful when defining what uncertainty is. But there is no mention of mind anywhere in this area of mathematics.
That we can take pure mind, pure frequencies, and by adding these thoughts together and complexifying them, we can give rise to space-time extension and matter. And you can see this in the Fourier transform. This has to do with the property of phase and orthogonality. If you start bringing phase into the picture, if you have a function that has no phase and all constituent waveforms are completely equal in amplitude and all this, you get a delta function in space and time, which is a singularity, which has no extent. There is no space and time. But if you start adding...
What? Wait, okay. I don't even know how to break that down, to be completely honest. I'm so confused. A delta function. Okay, well, so there's two different types of delta. Like there's the Dirac function, the Dirac delta function, and the Kronecker function. Which one are we talking about? I mean, it sounds like the Dirac delta function, which is localized around a value. It's zero at every other it's zero at every value, and then oftentimes at x equals 0, it is infinite. This is used to define things like point charges or point masses or things like that. But it can also be used to describe, forces being imparted onto an object, the moment of imparting that energy, like when you I don't know, hit a baseball with a bat. The minute that the bat hits the ball could be defined by a Dirac delta function. So I mean, these are useful. I wouldn't call them singularities, though. I don't know if that's accurate. I could be an accurate term for them, but I don't know whether or not it is. I don't know how we got from these from Fourier transforms to the Dirac delta function, but we did.
Variation and phase into the mix, then you start getting extension, which means space and time starts arising. So space and time, physicality, matter, depends on mind, which is frequency, and how this occurs is by introducing phase relationships into these frequency of mind, which gives rise to extension.
Okay, I should probably explain. Phase, in the context that Morgue is referring to here, and is not getting it very accurate at all, could really just be defined as the I'm trying to find a good way to define this, and I don't have the way to like illustrate it on the screen, which would really help. So if you can imagine a sine wave moving through a coordinate space, you can define the point as essentially going up and down and sliding along. You'll always be able to form essentially a triangle. And I guess you could use either the sine or cosine value, but I think it's generally the sine value of the angle of the hypotenuse of that triangle is going to correspond to the phase of that wave. This has absolutely nothing to do with consciousness.
And you do this every time you go to sleep and dream at night. When you go to sleep and dream, you create an entire, it depends how you define extension, but you inhabit a dream world that you can enter into that seems from within that world to have extension. But ultimately, extension is a kind of illusion, and the extension ultimately depends on the phase relations of mind.
Eternity, Calvin Klein.
So
YouTube has gone to shit.
Let's see, what was I explaining? Oh yeah, so when you start getting into the quantum mechanical details of things, you start seeing that matter is not material at all. It behaves like waves. Waves of what? Scientists don't know, but we know that it is.
Yes, they do. Waves of probabilities, waves of distributions smeared through an energy field that we call quantum fields that are present at every point in space-time.
Is mind. And the reason why it's a big mystery for science is because they exist within a materialist dogmatic paradigm for dogmatic reasons, not for rationalist reasons, just because they are accustomed to it. And that is what the established scientific community agrees their consensus is. This certain stance, very dogmatic. It doesn't matter if you are wearing church robes or a lab coat. I don't care if you're being religiously dogmatic. You're being dogmatic. It doesn't matter if it's empirically and sensory dogmatic or faith-based dogmatism. It's dogmatism nonetheless.
Yeah, but there's a difference between dogmatism and religious dogmatism. Religious dogmatism doesn't mean dogmatism in general.
It's not rational. So, and this is not, by the way, anything that the founders of quantum mechanics would have found to be controversial or that they would disagree with.
Yeah, no, they definitely did disagree with it. In fact, the vast majority of the founders of quantum mechanics who were still alive at the time that the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation came about rejected it. The idea that consciousness had a role in the operation, or that mind had a role in the operation of quantum mechanics, or explaining what it is or how it works, was not ever really accepted by any of the major quantum mechanical revolutionaries of the 20th century. And that includes Planck, Einstein, Bohr, Bohm, de Broglie, Schrodinger, Heisenberg, Feynman, Dirac, Pauli, all of them. None of them would have thought something like that.
The founders of quantum mechanics agreed with the essence of our stance, and they don't teach you that when you go take a class in quantum mechanics.
Yeah, that's because it's not true. And I would actually know that they don't teach you that, because there's a few quantum mechanics courses I've taken through MIT OpenCourseWare, and they don't teach you that because it isn't true.
Max Planck, the founder of quantum mechanics, said that as a
Oh no, here we go. Okay, Max Planck was not the founder of quantum mechanics. He's one of the people that helped kick off the idea that this idea of there being a quantization to aspects of nature. That idea really started with him. That's why we call it the Planck constant, H bar, or the reduced Planck's constant. You know, when he did his studies into thermodynamics, and then Einstein came along and showed, you know, a particle-like nature to light with the photoelectric effect, and then de Broglie came along with his idea of matter waves, and then the double slit experiment came along, and then people like Schrodinger and Heisenberg came along, and then you really had, you know, the full idea of quantum mechanics. So Max Planck kind of, I guess you could say, got the ball rolling, but he's not like the sole founder of quantum mechanics. That's not how it works.
The man who has again, founder of quantum mechanics, Max Planck, said, as a man who has devoted himself to the research of atoms, I can tell you about atoms this much: there is no such thing as matter. There is no such thing as matter. So he's founder of quantum mechanics, is saying, someone who has devoted my whole life to the study of matter, I can tell you this: there is no matter. Matter does not exist. And additionally, he said that mind is the matrix of all matter. That essentially mind is primary. There's no such thing as matter, but there is mind, which is the controlling or foundational aspect of what gives rise to the illusion of matter. Schrodinger, you know, Erwin Schrodinger, famous for the Schrodinger Equation, which is at the very heart of quantum mechanics. That's one of the very first things that you learn if you take a course in quantum mechanics.
Yeah, it's very basic in terms of like actually defining what the actual motion of actual particles and stuff is. He used the Dirac equation because it considers relativistic effects, whereas the Schrodinger equation does not.
Schrodinger equation. Schrodinger believed that reality was similar to a dream, and he was very much
No, he didn't.
Against the prevailing interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the Copenhagen interpretation. And
a lot of the early founders were, because it was a very non-intuitive idea. The results that were being received just went against the intuition of the time. And so many people were uncomfortable with a lot of the conclusions and the paradigmatic framework that which quantum mechanics was held within at that time. But that doesn't mean that anything they may have said about that supports any one particular person or a position, nor does it mean that they thought that like consciousness or the mind had something to do with the quantum level of reality, because to most of them didn't. And a lot of their quotes are taken completely out of context by people who want to paint the picture that they somehow supported these asinine ideas when they did not.
You probably heard of Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's cat was developed by Schrodinger to show how absurd the current attempt to understand quantum mechanics was.
It was an attempt to show how absurd the concept of superposition was. Schrodinger didn't really know how to really wrap his head around the concept of a superposition, and he likened it to his experiment that he demonstrated, his thought experiment with the cat that is known today as Schrodinger's cat.
Schrodinger was saying, look, if you try to understand quantum mechanics like you guys are doing, you're going to get this crazy situation where cats can be both alive and dead at the same time. But guess what? If you go take a quantum mechanics course, they don't teach you that. They teach you Schrodinger's cat experiment or thought experiment as if it were true.
Well, not really, because a cat is a classical level object. It's either going to be alive or it's going to be dead. What they teach you is the concept of superposition, which is essentially to say that something like the state vector representing the observable of some state of some system is going to rotate about the complex plane into and out of all of the various states that it could potentially hold. So it's not meaningful to say it's in any of the states, but it's not meaningful to say that it's in none of the states at all. It's sort of oscillating into and out of each state, and only upon making a measurement or interacting with the system will it project itself into randomly, stochastically, into any one of the states. This is what the concept of superposition is. It's never been this idea that anything can exist literally in more places at once. That's just not at all what it's saying.
I'm sure, and if you've even seen a documentary on quantum mechanics, they probably, give you that example of, wow, quantum mechanics is so mysterious. Schrodinger's cat can be alive and dead at the same time. Schrodinger would be turning over in his grave saying, hey, no, I developed this thought experiment to show you how dumb your ideas are. That cannot be the case, what you are saying, because you're going to have this crazy situation where cats are alive and dead at the same time.
Yeah, but he didn't realize that these things don't apply to the classical level of reality. So that was kind of a thing that he missed there. And it doesn't really, his thought experiment doesn't really refute anything in quantum mechanics. So
this cannot be. Yet it is taught as though it were true. Because you get these crazy ideas and crazy contradictions if you take more conventional materialist interpretation of quantum mechanics. So
what is a materialist interpretation? The thing is, every interpretation of quantum mechanics is largely considered a physicalist interpretation. You're not really going to find an interpretation, the Everettian interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, the relational interpretation, objective collapse interpretations, Bohmian interpretations, or pilot wave interpretations. None of these are going to be construed in terms that are non-natural or supernatural, or they're going to be entirely physicalist, and they've always been interpreted that way. So to say that like a materialist interpretation of quantum mechanics, well, that's all of them that are at least seriously adhered to or have ever been seriously adhered to.
We've seen Planck and Schrodinger, and then Heisenberg. Heisenberg thought that reality was ultimately mathematical mind. He said that
he kind of like alluded to this idea that reality is fundamentally like a mathematical thing. It's mathematical in nature, which is something that a lot of physicists throughout the 1819 and into the 20th century, and then in the 2000s, or the end of the 18 and the 1900s, often thought, but it's not really true. But I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole that is the philosophy of mathematics.
The ideas of Pythagoras, that all reality is number, and the idea of Plato, that the domain of mind or forms is primary.
Platonism?
Heisenberg says when you start looking into quantum mechanics, you start to see that Plato and Pythagoras were correct.
I disagree.
That is a mathematical, formal, mental domain. So.
Long pause.
You know what? I
What?
have a lot.
What's
We
that?
have a lot more to go. But I have to take a piss because that coffee went right through me. So I'm gonna go take a piss real quick. Then we're gonna come back because I want to concentrate on this and not think about having to relieve myself. Maybe that's why I thought of peas and grapes. Maybe I have to pee, and that translated into peas. Be right back.
All right, I'm going to use
So
this.
basically, where we
No,
left
never
off
mind.
is
It's
that,
edited.
okay, we cannot explain quantum physics, scientists are saying, and we cannot explain consciousness. So what's going on here? So physicist Roger Penrose and
Lord.
anesthesiologist Stuart Hammerhoff offer a model.
I love it. Anesthesiologist and a physicist talking about neuroscience. It's just, we're going to get the orchestrated objective reduction, or the OR model here.
Of consciousness from quantum mechanics. Gleiser poses it as a question. Could thoughts exist in some sort of quantum superposition in an unconscious level, only to become conscious when there is a specific selection?
That would imply sort of a Platonistic idea about thoughts, that thoughts exist independently of minds which consider or deliberate, or minds which are about them. That's a very, very strange idea, I think. That is not something I think a lot of philosophers would probably be on board with.
Akin to a measurement of the electron's position. They see the protein tubulin, which forms the microtubules that make up the skeleton of neurons, as enabling the entangled quantum states, the force of a choice. So let's answer this, but I want to see, hold on, let me see how far I have to read here before I...
This holiday,
Dear
join me
Lord
and
of
make
mercy.
music with Guitar Center.
He also tips his hat, let's see, to so-and-so. Quantum entanglement between electrons and the neurons might mean that contact can be maintained over considerable distances because two entangled particles will act together even when separated. That said, we can be fairly certain that classical physics doesn't account for consciousness either. Gleiser suggests that their cooperation between quantum and classical physics, depending on the level, may be part of the explanation. All right, so let's take a look at this answer. So basically they're saying, hey, we can't understand quantum mechanics. We can't understand consciousness. Well, hey, maybe consciousness is kind of dependent on quantum mechanics because we have this idea of superposition, and maybe we can combine the two and get some sort of answer there. But wait a minute, there are some problems. Now look, okay, look. They're getting this all wrong. Now, they're correct in that there's some sort of commonality between quantum mechanics and consciousness, or just sentience or mind in general. Yes, there is a very important connection there, but you're not going to explain consciousness simply by saying that the brain perhaps exhibits quantum mechanical states. But they are correct in trying to use superposition as a possible explanation, but just not in the way that they're using it. So let's talk a little bit about superposition and also how this...
Yes, let's. I love the topic of superposition. It's one that a lot of people completely misunderstand.
It follows with understanding mind and consciousness and quantum mechanics. Okay, so what is superposition? Superposition basically says...
Superposition, what is it? Let's find out.
That a particle, and please keep in mind that I'm going to simplify this for sake of time and both complexity. But superposition basically says that a particle can exist in many states at once. Now, this is not entirely true. A particle is still in one quantum state, but that quantum state itself is made up of a multiplicity, sometimes even an infinity of quantum basis states.
There you go.
But saying it in a simplified way, quantum mechanics superposition says that a particle can be in many states at once. So what does that mean?
Superposition is the concept that any state that a state vector is in can be written as a linear combination of a set of basis states, with the state vector not actually fully being in any of those one states, but being written as a combination, a probabilistic combination of a multitude of states. So I was actually quite surprised that they did actually a really good job there on the definition of a superposition. I was very surprised by that.
Let's say you have electron, and you say that this electron is in a superposition of let's use location. So what this means is that they treat the electron as being, we might say, everywhere at once in all possible locations.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you take a measurement of that electron, and that measurement is, let's say, that electron being encountering a hitting a screen or something. When you take a measurement of it, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's observation," but that's not really true. It's not like just looking at it makes it happen, or you're taking a measurement of it, right? So when you take a measure of this electron, it collapses into one state. Now, it has a probability of a certain state that it will collapse into, but it will collapse into one state. Now, if any of this sounds hard to understand or crazy, it's because it is kind of crazy. This is an idea that you get when you try to take quantum mechanics from a materialist perspective, right? So again, in a nutshell, they say, okay, you have this particle. This particle is governed by the wave function, and this says that this particle can be in a superposition of a vast multiplicity of states, so let's say in position space, so a vast multiplicity of positions. But when you take a measurement, the wave function collapses into only one position. So understood simplistically, it would be saying this electron is everywhere. Okay, this electron is everywhere. However, when you take a measurement or check to see where it is, it'll only be in one place. And there's a certain probability.
If you make a measurement on a state vector, it will project to being fully in one of the basis states. Essentially, the inner product of the state vector is equal to 1 when you take the inner product of that state vector with the basis vector representing the state. Wait, no, not 1. 0. It will be 0 because they'll be perfectly aligned with one another. 1 would be if they were orthogonal to one another. So, but prior to that, it's written as a combination of a variety of different states. The vector, it has a component that makes it up, that corresponds to every potential state. But when you measure it, it will project to being essentially parallel or on top of one of the basis states, i.e. in that state. You're projecting the vector onto the basis state. Also known as a state vector reduction or wave function collapse.
Associated with where it will be. So let's say there's a very, very high, if there's, let's say there's 4 possible positions, or let's say three possible positions. There might be a very high probability it will be in the center position, and low probabilities it'll be on the side positions. Now, again, if this sounds kind of hard to grasp or how to understand, it's because this is an absurd idea. They're basically saying you have this particle and it's everywhere, but when you look at it, it's only one place.
No, that's not what's being said. What I just said. Before you measure a particle, the state vector describing it in the space that which corresponds to the state of observables, the state of the observable that you're trying to measure, that state vector will be written as a linear combination of all of the basis states. There will be a component corresponding to each of the basis states making up that state vector. However, if you measure it, it will project stochastically into one of the basis states where it is only in that basis state It would be like measuring along just the x direction, but not the y or the z direction. Whereas prior to measurement, there's an x and a y and a z component that make up that vector in that space. That's the difference.
It's an absurd position. But and you only get this absurd result because scientists don't want to admit the ontology of mind, that mind exists. So let's see how we can easily solve.
Wait, what? Even physicalists and naturalists admit mind exists. I think the mind exists. I think even people like Sean Carroll, who's a actually pretty prominent naturalist, I would say, would agree that the mind exists. It's just about the nature of the mind. Is it a physical thing? Is it a non-physical thing? Is it a natural, not natural? Monist, dualist, substance dualist, what is the mind? I think that's the greater question there.
Solve this by putting mind into the equation and how this relates to mind and consciousness. And I've given this example before. So we have an electron that exists in a superposition of possible states.
Sweet.
Since retirement, I've been trying
fuck
new
me,
things.
standing.
With Frank's Red Hot, I put
Fuck
that shit on everything.
me, standing. Okay, that was actually a pretty good one. I'm
Wow.
not gonna lie.
Look at this.
I like theirs. I like their.
94% of people believe company culture.
I'm sorry. I'm
is-
just a small. Guys, I'm just a small, poor YouTuber. I have no money. At least to buy YouTube Premium, that is. I don't often use ad blockers because I know people that have had some issues with them, and I know a lot of people that have said even the best ones don't work for blocking all ads. It's not really something I've ever considered. So unfortunately, as unprofessional and annoying as it fucking is for not just you guys but myself, we're going to have to sit here and bear through these stupid, ridiculous fucking ads because YouTube wants to saturate their platform to push us all to buy YouTube Premium so they can make more money.
And it has varying possibilities of where it could be if you were to measure it. Now, if you were to say, think about a human being, I right now exist in a superposition of possible states. So basically, what am I going to do in the very next moment?
Okay, not really though, because you're a classical object. Like, you're stationary now, and there aren't any outside forces acting upon you with enough of a force to change your movement. So I can presume that in the next probably few instances, at least, you will remain stationary.
There are many things that I could do in the next moment. I can continue talking to you right now. I can decide, hey, I'm going to go take a piss. I can decide that I'm going to go get some food from the refrigerator. I can decide to do jumping jacks right now. There are infinite possibilities of what I could do next.
Near infinite possibilities.
Near infinite possibilities of what I could do
There you go.
next. I could start doing handstands. I could, whatever. But there will be some probability that I will do one thing over the other. It is a lot more likely that I will continue here talking rather than just suddenly jumping up and doing jumping jacks. However, really, it's a deterministic process because I am going to mentally choose to do something rather than another thing because of reasons. For example, I'm going to continue talking to you right now rather than getting...
Because of... Hey, guys, I'm going to review this video because of reasons. Reasons.
Up and doing jumping jacks because it is important to me to get out this information, and doing jumping jacks is not going to do much except, and get my cardio exercise in or something like that. But obviously this is more important to me, so I'm going to choose to do this one. So if we want to talk sort of in quantum mechanical terms, I exist in a superposition of all possible states, but I am choosing to continue talking rather than another one because of reasons that I have. It's ultimately a deterministic process. However, for you, it would seem to be probabilistic. If you were looking at me from the outside, it would seem probabilistic because you aren't me. And so you don't know what I'm going to choose. Now, I know what I'm going to choose because I'm the one making the choice. For you, if you're looking at me, you probably think, okay, well, what's he going to do next? It's highly probable that he's going to continue talking. Now, but that might not be true because just a few minutes ago, I went up to go to the bathroom. So that is another thing. It might be low on probability. I'm not doing that every second. It's very low on but it could happen.
I mean, these things are probabilistic, yes, but they're not stochastic like they would be at the quantum level of reality. I mean, unless you take a libertarian view of free will, which I don't. Most people, well, I should say most philosophers at least don't. But yeah, I guess in a sense you could say that a classical object exists in a superposition. It's just that the inner product between the basis vector that we would observe the classical object in and the state vector representing the classical object is so close to zero, so infinitesimally close to zero that you can just treat it as zero and say that it's in the state. This is something that's sort of called the Heisenberg Cut, what's ultimately the gray area between the quantum level of reality and the classical level of reality.
Happen. So for you, the next action, my next state is probabilistic for you. But it's not actually probabilistic, right? It's only probabilistic because you don't have access to all the information. You're missing information. That is, you aren't me and you don't know all my subjective processes. You don't know if I have to go to the bathroom or not. So for you, it's a probability, but it's not actually a probability. It's only a probability because you are missing information. In actuality, it is a deterministic process. I have access to all the information, and I will choose one thing over another based on reasons and what takes priority, what is weighted more than the other in terms of will to power and all those sort of things. So, and now why am I talking about this? So I want you to notice that, so I want you to take away a couple things from this. Notice that I exist in a superposition of many possible states. I could keep talking to you. I could do jumping jacks. I can go to the refrigerator. I can go take a nap. I am in a superposition of many states.
We are not in a superposition of states, at least not in any meaningful sense. I also, sorry, I was coughing. I couldn't pause the video earlier. But yeah, you're not in a superposition. Also, this idea that well, it's deterministic, you just don't have epistemic access to all of the variables to be capable of determining the evolution of the system. This doesn't apply to quantum mechanics. We know that there are no local hidden variables, or at least models that propose them are just essentially bound to fail, primarily because of the violation of Bell's inequalities, which show that reality is fundamentally non-local, which seems to indicate that there aren't really any hidden variables there determining it. We could also look at the violation of the Legge-Garg inequalities, which show that reality is non-real, which goes against what a hidden variable theory would tell us, that there are real properties or real quantities to these properties prior to and independent of measurement, but there isn't. And then the Kocher-Specken theorem, which tells us that or the Kochen-Specker theorem, which tells us that reality is fundamentally non-contextual, that what you measure is ultimately going to be related to how you're what it is that you're measuring, how you're measuring it, against which you're measuring it, where you're measuring it from, things like that, which also seems to go against the hidden variable theorem, where if the variables are definite and set prior to measurement, then what we measure shouldn't necessarily be relative to what we are measuring and how we're measuring it. So the idea of hidden variable theories is just not going to be taken seriously by any physicist, given what we understand about physical reality. Morgue didn't explicitly push one here, but I just wanted to throw that in there because that whole, well, it is deterministic, but you just don't have epistemic access to those variables is sort of the mentality or the idea behind these hidden variable theories.
Now note that that does not mean I'm everywhere at once. Okay, it doesn't mean that I am actually taking a nap right now. It doesn't mean that I'm actually at the fridge right now. It doesn't mean I'm actually doing jumping jacks right now. But when you look at me, I suddenly collapse down into one. Probably
Not really. You're a classical object, so you've always just been in one state, and that state can evolve through time.
probabilistically. That's not what's going on here. What's happening is that I'm in a superposition of states mentally, and I choose one over the other, and it is deterministic. So take away that I'm not actually everywhere at once. It's just mental possibilities that all exist at once, possibilities. And also note that it is deterministic. It's not probabilistic. It's only probabilistic for you because you don't have access to all the necessary information to know deterministically what my actions will be. So let's keep that in mind. Okay. And now let's talk about particles in quantum mechanics. So particles, like electrons in quantum mechanics, again.
Calvin Klein Defy.
Oh, fuck me.
Dare to defy.
It's not that they run ads, it's that they run so fucking many. You know, like this is literally one every 6 fucking minutes.
The reason why scientists will come up with absurd interpretations,
piece of shit, YouTube,
like saying
dirty
that
motherfucking cocksucking pieces of shit.
a particle will be everywhere at once and then probabilistically collapse into a certain position rather than another, is because they're denying mind. Because mind has no ontological, it has no ontology in their system, no ontological status. And
I don't know what that means. Most physicists would grant an ontology to the mind.
They only value materialistic processes. Only materialistic processes are valid in their paradigm, in their dogmatic materialist paradigm. So what I mean by this is, if you introduce mind into quantum mechanics, you no longer get these absurd results. In other words, an electron exists in a superposition of possible states, but that doesn't mean that it's everywhere at once. What it means is that, like me, the electron has an inner mental component, and then due to its inner mathematical processes, it will choose, choose implies consciousness, but not choose, but it will follow one path rather than another and end up at one location rather than another in a deterministic way based on its inner mathematical trajectory and the different possibilities.
Wait, so Morgue is pushing sort of a like hidden variables theorem. Okay, yeah, well, we just know that those are not very viable at all.
So important to take away from this is understanding that what's actually going on at the quantum mechanical level is that the electron has an inner aspect, just like I have an inner aspect, and the electron will follow one path rather than another based on inner deterministic processes, just like I will choose to do one thing over.
Actually, I think that we can just use things like the principle of stationary action and aspects of Lagrangian mechanics, Feynman's path integral formulation, to determine the most likely path that any quantum object would take through some sort of phase space, or Hilbert space, I should say.
Over another, based on inner deterministic processes. But just like for you looking on the outside, and my processes will be seemingly probabilistic, but aren't actually, that electron will seem to behave probabilistically, but is not actually probabilistic. It is deterministic. It's just scientists deny and don't have access to all the information available, which would be the inner processes of that electron.
That doesn't make sense. Yeah, this is just the hidden variables theory. The idea that, oh, well, yeah, there's just variables there that we don't have access to that are determining how the system's going to behave. No, there's not, for the reasons that I outlined earlier.
So the absurdities of quantum mechanics are only there because they take a materialist stance. It would be like trying to explain my behavior if you denied that I had an inner aspect or an inner mind. If you deny that I have an inner aspect or an inner mind, if you deny that, suddenly my actions would seem very mysterious. You know, how is this? What is guiding? What is guiding this person's actions?
Well, to a determinist, it wouldn't be weird. A determinist would just say that it's all a bunch of mechanistic and ultimately chemical and physical processes that ultimately amount to everything that you are and everything that you do. So to them, that's not complicated at all.
If they have no inner component. Now, you might try to appeal to, like deterministic physical processes, but I think you get my point in the analogy between a human being and a particle. And that if you deny the inner aspect, you're going to start to get a lot of problems. You're going to start getting a lot of difficulties. You know, if you looked at human beings, if sort of you had a bird's eye view and you were watching human beings walking around, let's say walking around a mall, it would seem very chaotic and probabilistic if you denied the fact that they had mind. It would seem like, oh, well, they seem to follow a certain path, but it's very probabilistic. Sometimes one goes this way, sometimes another one goes this way. It all seems very random. Is it actually random? No, their inner mind is guiding them. So same thing at the particle level. When you're looking at these different particles, for scientists, it seems very random, probabilistic, probable, based on probability and randomness, because they're denying the inner aspect.
What is this inner aspect, though? And how would we measure it to know that it's real? How can we determine what it is, how it works, how to measure it, if that's possible? How do we determine any of that?
It's actually a deterministic process. Now, you can see that these more absurdities arise because there are different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So, for example, there's one interpretation that says, well, the particle is everywhere at once. Another interpretation is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, because they're trying to deny the mind, the inner aspect of the particle, the mental component. So one of the
No, that's not what they're doing. They're just taking the Schrodinger equation as being ontically real, the wave function as being ontically real, and then assuming the consequences that follow from that. In that the wave function evolves across the entire Hilbert space, and all potential states are eventually realized.
Their solutions is saying, well, that particle, instead of saying it is everywhere at once, it basically says that for every position that particle could be in, there is another universe sort of branches out. And
see, this is where it gets hard with the many worlds interpretation or the Everettian interpretation. It's not it's not that literal universes are being birthed. In more technical terms, it's essentially stating that the wave function of the universe evolves across the entire Hilbert space, so that all potentialities are ultimately realized. Whether it's infinite potentialities, it's probably not, but close to. You could consider it infinite. And what this means is that because of our experience and how we're limited, we're like a extraordinarily thin thread that is like weaved through one particular path in that Hilbert space. And that's the universe that is everything that we are and everything that we experience. But there's still this vast area of probability. Well, what to us would be probability, but is actuality if you were to trace yourself through it. So that essentially there's many different timelines of the one universe through which all possibilities are ultimately realized.
And exists. So, let's break it down to three positions. That the particle can be in position A, B, or C. one interpretation of quantum mechanics will say, well, there's a universe where it's at A, and then another universe where it's at B, and then another universe where it's at C. Again, this is really absurd. That would
timelines, not universes. It'd be the same universe, but there's 3 different timelines, so to speak. There's 3 different paths through the Hilbert space that define that particle as being in specifically either position A, position B, or position C. We just don't have access to the other worlds or timelines, so to speak, in which other possibilities have been realized. So to us, they remain possibilities. But in the total space of states, in you could say the really full scope of the universe, every possibility is ultimately realized.
It would be like if you're trying to explain my actions, but aren't allowed to appeal to my mind, you would say, well, you know, why is this person doing one thing over another? You may say, well, maybe it's because in this universe, they're standing here, you're sitting here talking to me through the camera, but in another universe, they're doing jumping jacks. And in another universe, they're going to the bathroom. In another universe, they're going to the refrigerator. In another universe, they're taking a nap. You see the absurdities that you get. And the reason why they come up with these ideas is because they don't want to acknowledge the mental component. You see the great hoops that they have to jump through and the absurd ideas that they have to develop to try and make their materialist paradigm fit. This is
Yeah, it just seems that what we're doing here is just presupposing that mind isn't material, and then making the, what I would argue, rather asinine claim that scientists, the modern scientific paradigm rejects mind completely as being ontically real or having any, concrete reality whatsoever, and that, reality is 100% nothing but material. The second part just depends on what you mean by material, whether or not that's true, or whether or not I would consider that true. But yeah, that's just, there's some presumptions that are being made in terms of the worldview that's being pushed right now.
Extremely dogmatic and religious. This is like saying, well, if God exists, why is there evil in the world? And then, people who are theologians or religious will try and like come up with all these crazy ideas of oh man, well, that's true. Well, how is there evil in the world? Well, maybe it's because God gave us free will and they want us to and have free choice. And well, why does he send people to hell? Well, is it really free will if he sends people to hell? And they have to constantly, it's because their paradigm is wrong.
Apologetics. You're just referring to what is known as apologetics. That's why it's called apologetics.
Same thing with scientific materialism. Like, well, how can these particles make these act this way? Well, maybe they're everywhere at once, or maybe there's
the laws of physics, the Dirac equation, the Schrodinger equation. These things can help you determine the behavior of particles. Quantum field theory, if you want to get really basic.
Infinite universes for each one. No. It's because your paradigm is wrong. It's simply and elegantly an inner aspect of the particle. So let's.
When the Panera craving hits, will you be ready? Yes.
My fucking
God. Continue here. And one thing that I want to point out is that this position, our position of Hyperianism and ontological mathematics, is not panpsychism. It's idealism. Okay. So what panpsychism says, so materialism says that all realities matter. This is riddled with logical paradoxes. It's clearly false for anyone that has any ounce of reason. There are.
I don't think we can really say that. There's a lot of some of the world's most brilliant minds did and still do believe in a materialist perspective. So
there are some scientists and neurosurgeons and some thinkers that are starting to say that, you know what, maybe materialism is wrong. Who would have thought? So, and they're moving over to panpsychism. Now, if you have materialism on one end and idealism on the other end, which is our position that reality is mind, panpsychism is kind of in the middle. And you can see it's like they don't want to let go of matter. So they're moving over to panpsychism. Not many, a few are. What panpsychism says is that reality is material. The natural world is all that there is, but matter also has a mental component to it. So basically, matter has mind. So for example, they would say that electrons have a subjectivity. In other words, there is what it is like to be an electron. Theoretically, you could be an electron, and you would be electron, making your electron choices. Right. So it's this sort of fusion of mind and matter, inseparable two sides of the same coin in a certain way.
I'm confused. You said your position isn't panpsychist, but with at least how you defined panpsychism, couldn't it be? Couldn't that inner structure or whatever the hell it was you were alluding to that exists in these electrons and whatnot just be their fundamental consciousness? Isn't that what you're saying that it is? That it's the mind? It's this mind aspect? I'm just really... It seems like we're advocating for something that ultimately aligns very closely with panpsychism and then immediately denying that it's panpsychist. I mean, it's I think it is panpsychist, and it just takes it a step further all the way into idealism, but still retains a lot of the elements of panpsychism. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, but what the fuck do I know?
This is not our stance. Our stance is idealism, which says mind is primary and matter is derivative of mind. So you see, there's a big difference here. Materialism says all there is matter. Panpsychism kind of puts mind and matter on equal footing
yeah, but idealism isn't mutually exclusive with panpsych. You could be an idealist and a panpsychist. In fact, it would probably be easier, at least I would think, to be a panpsychist if you were an idealist than if you weren't. If all matter arises from the mind, then it makes more sense that all matter contains an element of mind or an element of consciousness, or however you want to word it, which is ultimately, at least in some very simplistic sense, what panpsychism is.
Reflections of each other are two sides, kind of a fusion. Idealism says there is only mind, matter is derivative, an illusion generated by mind. Now, panpsychism runs into a lot of problems. But one thing that I want to mention,
I agree,
and I want to make it clear that it's not panpsychism, because panpsychism is sort of gaining a little bit of traction, and people might go, oh, well, you're...
So I agree with Morgue when he says that, my position isn't panpsychist, but I definitely think it could be. His position is not mutually exclusive with panpsychism. He might not be taking, specifically a panpsychist perspective, but it's definitely compatible with it.
You're just talking about panpsychism. No. In our system, mind is primary, defined by frequency functions, and then matter arises as being transformations of that frequency functions by introducing phase and having a space and time representation of those frequency functions. Once
straight gobbledygook
to introduce phase into the mix. But what this means is that electrons, for example, in panpsychism, electrons there would be a subjective element to them. Now, in Hyperianism and ontological mathematics, that is not the case. Electrons are not a mind, but a complex of thought. And there's a very big difference. So electrons do have
there's a difference? This will be interesting.
Mental aspect, but it doesn't mean that the electrons have a subjectivity. You couldn't, for example, incarnate as an electron. That's not what's going on here. Electrons don't have a subjectivity, like I and you have a subjectivity. There is what it is like to be me. There is not a what it is like to be an electron.
Hey, I agree with that. There is not what it's like to be an electron. That makes no sense.
However, even though electrons don't have a subjectivity associated with them, they are mind in that they are thought. And there's a difference here. So even though electrons aren't subjectivities, they can still be guided by an inner aspect of mind, inner mathematical frequency functions.
Wait, but that just kind of sounds like panpsychism. I mean, where are we even at right now?
Mathematical laws. This is because they are a thought and a structure that is guided by frequency functions. So a way to understand, this might sound really complicated, but it actually isn't. An easy way to understand this is, think of yourself. You are a subjectivity. Now, if you close your eyes and imagine an apple, that apple that you're imagining, that apple is still mind, is it not? Yes, it is. It is a thought. But does that apple have subjectivity? Is that apple suddenly its own mind that can decide to, apples can't decide, but you know what I mean. If you were thinking of, let's say, a cat or a human or something, if you were imagining a human, that human isn't suddenly going to gain its own subjectivity and make its own independent choices apart from you. It is an aspect of you. It is your thought. So same thing with an electron. An electron is a thought that is a product of all of us together. So all of reality, it arises by all of our mental processes acting together. So the difference between, say, your thought and the thought of this cup is that this thought is a collective thought. It doesn't belong to any one mind. It is a product of the collective thought.
That sounds like just a really weird way of getting around saying it's an objective thing. Like, I don't know. I just think it would be to say the cup is objective. It's there, and we can perceive it. I guess maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just, a plebe who doesn't understand philosophy of mind.
Universal thought, you might say.
What?
And so that's important to understand. This is not panpsychism. Electrons do not have subjectivities, but electrons are mind. Particles, matter.
Lord have fucking mercy. Oh, this makes me just want to end it. This is just fucking ridiculous.
Panpsychism says that matter has subjectivity associated with it. Hyperianism does not say that. Hyperianism says that every one of us has subjectivity, and matter is a product of us in that it is our collective thoughts. So everything around us is thought that has a material representation via space-time function. So contrary to panpsychism, matter does not have a subjective element to it. Rather, matter is thought that are products of subjectivities operating as a collective. Man, I thought this was going to be a short one today. Boy, was I wrong. Let me continue here. So this is again a quote by Marcelo Gleiser, who says, whatever the resolution may be, I'm going to try and rip through this rest of this because we got to get to our secret live stream. We have more. I got to answer questions. But whatever the resolution may be, we still do not know how to avoid the arguments from the Mysterians. Mysterians are basically people who say a position that says that reality is unknowable. You can't know it. It's forever mysterious. So the nature of consciousness could be one of those unknowables that many people will find very hard to live with. I, for one, embrace it.
This sounds like a very interesting position. Not something that I think that would be seriously adhered to by many people, though.
This unknowability may well be what will rescue what is left of our humanity from the unstoppable mechanization and objectification of modern existence. Now, this is just dumb. So he's basically saying, maybe we'll never know. The Mysterians could be right. And you know what? I like that we will never know. And that because that saves us from mechanization and objectification of existence. That's stupid. First of all, you're denying the possibility of knowledge. I mean, can you really? At this point, you're definitely. I mean, this person never claimed to be a philosopher, but philosophia, lover of knowledge. You're a denier of knowledge at this point. You're not only you're not a philosopher, you're an enemy of philosophy. You're a hater of knowledge, and just because you have knowledge of existence does not objectify and mechanize existence. What objectifies and
what does that even mean? I don't... Wow, there are some weird terms flying around here tonight.
mechanizes existence is saying that reality is a mechanistic material process. What brings life and vibrancy into reality is understanding that, that there is both objectivity and subjectivity, and science denies the subjective component. So ultimately, reality does operate via objective rules, yes, of course, but we are...
Science doesn't deny that there's subjectivity to our lives. Science doesn't deny that at all. It's just not necessarily entirely concerned with trying to understand it because it doesn't have well-established and meaningful methodologies for doing so. But I think most people would recognize that there's an objective reality and then there's our subjective experience of it. There's the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions that arise from that. Yeah.
Are all mental subjectivities. So science is what scientific materialism is, what is mechanizing reality, not knowledge. Knowledge saves us from mechanization by revealing that reality is mind and that we are all eternal living subjectivities defined.
I would be curious to know what Morgue means by knowledge here. And science does mechanize reality because it attempts to understand how reality works through processes and mechanisms, interactions, things of that nature.
By mathematics, yes, but living mathematics, not dead, dry, mechanistic, abstract mathematics, but ontological, living frequency, energy patterns. That's what we are. And knowledge does not take us away from this. It brings us closer to it. It reveals it to us. And this is the whole point. Know thyself and you will know the universe and the gods, that classic aphorism. And this is part of it inscribed at the entrance to the oracle at the Temple of Delphi. And this idea of that reality can't be known is also absurd. So by the Mysterians, he means philosophers like Thomas Nagel, who says, and Colin McGinn, who says we are not equipped to understand the workings of consciousness. And David Chalmers argue that although we can know the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, false, it is simply beyond the conceptual apparatus of human beings to understand how this can be the case. This is, again, how stupid. This is so, okay. So listen to the absurdity of this position. Although we know that conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, which is false. This is logically fallacious, as I've showed in many of my videos. We know that
it's really not false. I mean, that's where all the empirical literature points explicitly.
That it cannot be the case that mind is the product of the brain.
Except that it is.
We know that it cannot have evolved, and we
except that it did.
We know all the logical fallacies that entail. Watch my
except that there's none.
Video called "Consciousness Cannot Have Evolved," or could not have evolved. I go into detail on why it is 100% fallacious to try and say that mind is some sort of evolutionary process or epiphenomenon of the brain. So although we know that conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, that's false. And if you do, please show me how you know this. Go ahead.
I'd love to. Would you like to come on my channel and have a discussion about it sometime? I'm sure I could even get a hold of one or two professionals who would love to come on and discuss it as well.
I'm waiting. I'd love to hear, because that's one of the great unsolved mysteries of scientific...
Not of neuroscience.
Materialism. So go ahead, explain it to me if that's the case. No, scientific materialism can't, because it's outside their paradigm. So that quote is ridiculous. You don't know that. You're just...
we do.
You're just dogmatically claiming it. So although they argue, although we know that conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, it is simply beyond the conceptual apparatus of human beings to understand how this can be the case. This is riddled with even just this sentence.
Well, I mean, it's not really that ridiculous of a thought, because it, at least in my mind, because it seems to be no different than saying something like, well, we can know that black holes exist and how they form, but we can't really know much beyond that. Like there's very, very little we can learn about what goes on inside them, the processes that occur inside them, if any, the particular material they're made out of, any any of that stuff. That's beyond our capability. But we know that black holes are there. We know that they're physical. We know how they form, and we can know their mass, charge, and spin. So there's like a select amount of things that we can know about them, but then there's a large amount that we don't know about them. But that doesn't mean that they can't be a physical or a natural thing. Just like with with the mind. We can know that it's physical, we can know that it's natural, but that doesn't necessarily mean we know everything about how it physically arises out of the brain.
Is riddled with fallacies. So first of all, although that we know the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, big fallacy there. Because you don't, you're just dogmatically claiming it. Then going on to say,
yeah, but what fallacy would that be? What fallacy is being committed here?
It is simply beyond the conceptual apparatus of human beings to understand how this can be the case. First of all, no, it's not beyond the conceptual apparatus of human beings to understand how this can be the case. It is beyond the capability of a dogmatic materialist paradigm to be able to account for how this can be the case, because it literally can't be the case because it's a false position.
What the fuck was that?
It cannot be the case. It's not that human beings are incapable. It's that is a false case. And
it seems that you're just saying, oh, it's wrong because it's false. That's just saying that it's wrong because it's wrong. Like, we're not really hearing anything in terms of an argument here for why we should consider a connection between quantum mechanics and consciousness.
We can absolutely know that this is not the case by showing how it's a logical fallacy, that, for example, it cannot have evolved if it is an epiphenomenon. And if you try to claim some sort of emergent property as well, you can't just claim it. You have to show how it could be the case that it is an emergent phenomenon. And no.
Yeah, but neuroscientists honestly have largely done that with a vast array. Excuse me, a vast array of cognitive thought processes. Like I've mentioned earlier, things like our desires and beliefs and how we develop and form those. We have a very pretty good understanding of that. Emotions, we have a pretty good understanding of that. Decision making, introspection, retrospection, goal setting, all of that stuff. We've got a strong understanding of that. Reasoning and understanding logic. We understand that pretty well. We understand what parts of the brain are involved in this, and we can see how in other animal species that have those same parts of the brain, but they're less developed. They have a less density in terms of neurons. We can see how there's differences. How they have the same processes, but they're not nearly developed as they are with us. So this idea that the mind emerges out of the brain is, I would argue, pretty damn well substantiated by the empirical literature that we have available to us.
Rational mechanism can be provided by science how it could be the case. It's just, again, a dogmatic claim. So it's riddled with fallacies. We know.
But even if that were true, that doesn't necessarily mean that your position is true. You could show the falsity of a physicalist or a materialist perspective, and it still wouldn't mean that your position, particularly on the nature of the mind and consciousness, is necessarily correct. See, this is the thing. It's not so much about refuting a position you disagree with as it is about erecting good argumentation in defense of your own position.
That the brain cannot produce mind. It can't within a material. It cannot. So
if the brain can't produce mind, why do humans have a brain, and why do so many cognitive and mental aspects seem to be connected inextricably to the brain and what it does? Like, I have to be honest, I would argue that the prior probability of consciousness and sentience being entirely physical is significantly higher than otherwise. Because, I mean, just the simple thought of, well, if you shoot somebody in the head, you can kill them, seems to be enough to establish that. The brain obviously plays a role in terms of the production and maintenance of consciousness. The question is now, to what extent and in what ways does this happen? But the idea that it happens is thoroughly substantiated by the literature that we have available on the subject. Explicitly shows that essentially every facet of human consciousness, human cognitive capability, is rooted in the brain to some extent or another. I mean, this just comes down to understanding the empirical literature in the subject and the conclusions that it reaches.
So it's not that it's beyond the conceptual apparatus to understand how it could be. It's that it can't.
But the bigger point that I wanted to get to there is if our mind, if our consciousness and our sentience has nothing to do with the brain, why do we have one, and why is it so closely connected to our consciousness and our sentience? So it seems to me that this is a problem for a substance dualist view as well. If what our consciousness and our sentience, what our emotions and our experience and our existence fundamentally are, is non-physical and not really rooted in material things, then why is it that if I take somebody's brain out of their head, there's practically no human being there? There's just the physical body. Why can't the mind use some other form of matter, like the left butt cheek, or your testicles, or your foot, or like your finger, or something like that? What is it about a brain that makes it so important to understanding and quantifying what consciousness is, if at least fundamentally consciousness has nothing to do with the brain? Models that, or I guess you could say, let me say worldviews that posit that. I think this is a question that they really struggle to explain. And I don't think that it's even denied that there is an inextricable and very, very prominent, very strong correlation between consciousness and sentience and the brain as a whole in the various ways in which it functions. This idea that consciousness can't have anything to do with the brain, or at any rate very little, just seems absurd to me.
Can't be, but we can know how mind can produce matter. We can know it. We can. So there is no Mysterian element to reality. We can, through Hyperianism and ontological mathematics, explain it. I have done so in many of my videos. And again, if you're thinking, well, how do we know that reality is mathematical? How do we know that it's primarily mind? I don't have time to, I would have to give an entire course right here, right now. But throughout my videos, you'll find the answer to these questions. We can absolutely know that reality is meant.
That's rather funny, because I think that in just a mere, if somebody gave me just 20 or 30 minutes, I think I could do a pretty substantial job of defending a physicalist perspective as it comes to interpreting the nature of the mind and of human consciousness. I mean, I'm not saying I could answer every objection that could be given, every argument that's been given, or anything like that. But I think I could lay out a pretty substantive case. So, I mean, I have to be honest, if you have a worldview that you couldn't explain in a 20 or 30-minute video, or even an hour video, and this one's an hour and 15 minutes, it seems that either A, you don't know how to defend it, or B, your worldview is just so convoluted, it would ultimately not even be worth defending.
Mental and mathematical and rational. And we can know how it has the capability of giving rise to matter through Fourier transforms, frequency functions being translated into space-time functions, etc., etc., etc. So, first of all, there is no Mysterian element to reality. We can know it. So, and listen to this ridiculous argument of the Mysterians.
Well, the question then is, on your perspective there, Morgue, is if we can know reality, through what mechanisms, or rather methods, do we come to know reality? That would just be a question I would have. I'm not even saying that he couldn't answer it. I think he probably could give somewhat of a reasonable answer. It's just a question that I have.
Although we know the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain. No, you don't. If so, please tell me how. Oh, you can't, so you don't know it. But then they go on.
By the way, if anybody that's out there that watches this or listens to this knows how to get in contact with Morgue, let me know, because I would love to have a discussion with him on the nature of consciousness, how it relates to quantum mechanics, all of this stuff.
To just say outright that they don't know it. It is simply beyond the conceptual apparatus of human beings to understand how that it can be the case. So again, there's multiple logical fallacies at play, and I find this hilarious. Please, please just look at how ridiculously and absurdly fallacious and unintelligent this position is. Although we know that conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, it's beyond us to understand how it's nothing more than the brain. You're telling me that you know that the mind is just the brain.
Yeah, although we know black holes are physical objects, we don't know what the fuck they're made of. Same basic principle.
But that you don't know how the mind is just the brain. Do you see? Do you? And the entire paradigm.
See, this is the problem. I'm not satisfied with saying that the mind is just the brain, because if I were to go into a, no pun intended, but a morgue and pull out the brain of a person who'd been dead for, several hours, there's no mind there. So the mind is not just a brain. And I take what would be considered a functionalist view when in terms of the philosophy of mind, when it comes to a physicalist and functionalist. When it comes to this, is that the mind is not just the brain, but all of the processes and functions that the brain engages in as it interfaces with itself and with the vibrant and massively active reality into which it is continuously submerged. And it interfaces with that through the sensory perception, through the senses. And all of this interfacing, these functions, these processes that occur across all of the brain that are continuously sustained, results in what we call consciousness. That you're not just going to look at a spot and say that's where it all is. That's just not how it works. Just like it's like looking at an engine. You can't look at an engine and say, oh no, that one piston right there, that's where the horsepower comes from. Because that's not the case. The horsepower is produced by all of the processes that the engine continually sustains as it runs. And it's the same thing with the brain and consciousness. If you shut the engine off, you no longer get horsepower. If you shut the brain off, you no longer get consciousness. Simple as that.
Of scientific materialism, scientific empiricism is riddled with absurdities like this. Now, again, I'm not saying that science isn't useful. It's very useful. Look at all the wonderful technology we have because of science. I'm talking to you right now because of science, great medical advances because of science. I am not denying the pragmatic usefulness of science. It's great for that. But it cannot claim to know what reality is. Pragmatic success does not entail epistemological knowledge of the ontology of reality. They can't say what reality is.
Well, that would actually be false if you took a pragmatic theory of truth, but I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of epistemology tonight either.
They just know how to create useful objects within it, and that's great, but you have to know what a thing is. It's a category error to say that science is revealing the ontological nature of reality, because that's not what it's doing. It's just modeling reality and creating pragmatic.
Well, again, that assumes a scientific instrumentalist view. That assumes that science just is sort of an instrument that gives us this epistemic knowledge of reality, but it doesn't reveal any of the ontology of reality. Whereas somebody like me, a scientific realist, would say, well, it gives us both, actually. And that actually seems to be the position that most scientists would adhere to, as a scientific realist perspective. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's largely what most of the philosophers that at least answer the question would say as well.
Useful tools and technologies, which is great, but you have to know what it is. And when you start to really look at science, when they try to explain existence, it's the most inept, illogical, fallacious thing you can possibly get. It is as absurd as religion. How does reality exist? Well, God created it. How does God exist? I don't know. Just as so many people are still trapped in religion, but people are starting to wake up. And a lot of people look at religion and go, oh man, that's crazy. How can people believe that? In years' time, people are going to have the same attitude towards scientific materialism. It's going to be just as absurd. Believing in the existence of material atoms that have some sort of independent existence from mind is going to be as absurd as believing in Zeus or Jesus or Allah or whatever you want to say. It's.
I don't think that. I mean, I suppose that could be true, but I don't think that the general trends that we've seen would support that. Things like physicalism and naturalism have only been better developed and have seen more adherence across both philosophy and science as we've progressed throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. I would say that I think that they will probably continue to do so, that things like, substance dualist or dualist perspectives on the mind, things like views that incorporate supernatural or non-natural aspects to them are just going to slowly fall away. I think that when it comes to just science in general, that's largely been what's happened. Science doesn't really consider these kinds of things because there isn't really any established precedent for doing so. And I think that's largely been what's founded this movement away from the idea that there are supernatural or non-natural effects taking place in reality, is that we just don't observe the kind of reality that seems to indicate that such is the case.
It's that crazy. And you can see how absurd this is in statements like, although we know that the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, we don't know how the conscious mind is more than the brain. We know it, but we don't know it.
I mean, me personally, I would say that it is more than physical, but it isn't. I mean, it is more than the brain, but it isn't more than physical. Because again, if you go up to a person who just recently died and you get their brain, you have just a brain, but you don't have a mind. So there has to be something more than just the brain. And I think it's also the processes that the brain engages in. Just like if I give you an engine, I'm not giving you horsepower. The engine has to be on and running. There's other functions that it needs to engage in order to produce the horsepower. Same thing like I was alluding to earlier with the brain and the mind.
Ridiculous. So let's continue because we're only a few more paragraphs here. Such an answer, Ray. This world is so crazy. It is astounding. It blows my mind that people take statements like this as intelligent statements. You can't get things more absurd than this. We know X.
Talking about absurd, I mean, I got to be honest. I really just haven't heard much in the way of an argument. I've heard, well, this is what science claims, and it's just ridiculous. This is just silly. This is absolutely. But what we believe is, it's totally based. It's based in super truth pilled. But all this science and bullshit. No, we got to get rid of that. That's dumb. It can't explain any of this. I haven't really heard anything in the way of arguments, though.
But we don't know X. Please give me my Nobel Prize and doctorate.
Go earn your Nobel Prize and your doctorate. Of course, it would be in the other order.
So such an answer. It's not even an answer. It's not an answer. Such an answer raises further questions. Yeah, it does. If the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, then we won't understand it. To understand it, we must look beneath it, and there is nothing.
What?
There is nothing beneath it.
I don't know what that means. What?
Oh, okay.
But I think he's quoting David Chalmers, and I don't really agree with David.
This is just getting more hilarious.
I don't really agree with a lot of David Chalmers' positions. I mean, I don't think he's wrong on everything, but there's a lot of what he says, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't agree with that.
But how do we know that? We don't actually. I can't get. I'm sorry. Hold on. I can't keep a straight face. I can hold on. Just give me a moment. I can finish this. I can finish this. I can.
Yeah, if you don't keep dropping ads on us every 6 fucking minutes, I promise, guys, I'm gonna try to find an ad blocker and just get that. Even if it doesn't remove all of them, if they're not every 6 goddamn motherfucking minutes, I'll be happy.
Okay. Hold on. I can do this. But how do we know that? We don't actually. All that we know is that efforts to understand the mind as merely what the brain does have not proven useful.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think most of the field disagrees with understanding the mind in physicalist terms. I think has proven quite successful. So, I mean, we know a hell of a lot about numerous aspects of human cognition. So, we haven't had to appeal to anything non-physical to get there.
Oof. If we assume that the mind is not merely what the brain does, we have some reasonable hope of understanding it further. Thank you. God damn it. That's where quantum physics may shed some light. It may provide, for example, a point of intersection between mind and brain. But there's no reason to think that's a full answer. God damn, that was a hard couple paragraphs to get through. All right. So here, look, in a nutshell, why can science not explain quantum mechanics, and why can science not explain?
I want to reiterate again, just because I think it's an important point to reiterate, is that it doesn't make sense to say science can't explain quantum mechanics when quantum mechanics is a broad explicative framework. Lord, I don't know. It's like saying economics can't explain trade. It just makes no sense. Economics is a framework from which we explain trade. I don't know. It's just mind-blowing that people actually make these kinds of statements. General relativity doesn't really explain gravity.
Consciousness.
Electromagnetism doesn't really explain light.
/ mind and subjectivity in general.
Sex doesn't really explain babies.
It's because the answers to both questions are that mind is primary. They cannot explain mind as subjectivity and what eventually becomes consciousness. First of all, they can't even fucking define consciousness properly. But the reason why they can't explain it is because they are assuming dogmatically that their materialist paradigm is correct and that mind is a product from the brain. The reason why they can't explain it is because what they are assuming to be true is a fallacious position. So yes, you can't explain it.
Yeah, but just saying something's fallacious doesn't mean anything. You got to explain what the fallacy is, where it's being committed, and how. You can't just say, "Oh, it's fallacious." That's not how it works. That's actually just called the fallacy. It is itself a fallacy, and it's the fallacy of just claiming that something's a fallacy without backing up how it is.
Because your premises are false. So as soon as we eradicate the dogmatic, false, and fallacious premise that reality is material and replace it with the true premise that reality is rational, mathematical mind, then we have absolutely no problem accounting for mind, because we know that mind is primary. And check out my other videos if you want to know how this is the case and why we know this is the case. Check out my book, Ontological Mathematics.
I love this. Yeah, I'm gonna make all these claims here, guys, but I'm not gonna explain them. If you just go check out my other videos, buy my book, so I can shove more ads down your throat every 6 minutes and stuff like that, and you have to buy my book and all that stuff so I can make money. Yeah, just go do that. I'm not gonna explain it here. I'm just gonna sit here and just kind of like wildly claim all these weird things that like no actual reputed professional in any field related to what I'm saying would even remotely agree with me. I don't really have a solid philosophical foundation on which I'm founding my worldview here, but I'm just going to make a bunch of wild ass claims and then tell you to go watch my other videos and buy my book if you want to learn more.
Mathematics, the science of the future. Check out Ontological Mathematics by Cody Newman. All these different books, right? All these different videos that I've made. I'm sure the Hyperion Source has videos on this as well. Anyway, I digress. Oof, I'm tired after that, trying to get through those last few paragraphs. But as soon as you eradicate these faulty premises and replace it with the premise, the true premise that we can show to be true based on the principle of sufficient reason that reality is mind, you no longer have the issue of accounting for mind. What the idealist paradigm has to do is account for matter, and we can account for matter. See, if materialists say that mind is primary, they have the task of explaining, if materialists say that matter is primary, they have the task of explaining how mind can be. We
just go talk to a neuroscientist would be my best piece of advice that I could give, I would think.
Saying that mind is primary, even though we can show how this is the case rationally and sufficiently, we aren't just dogmatically claiming it. We can show rationally how this is the case. But we have the task of showing how matter can be. This we can absolutely do. I've mentioned it before. Via Fourier transform, we can show how frequency functions, by introducing phase relationships, can give rise from a simple delta function into introducing extension, dimensionality into space-time functions. So we can account for matter. So our paradigm of a rational...
Yeah, we can account for matter too. It's largely hashed out by this little thing called relativistic quantum field theory. It's quite advanced, actually. It tells us what matter is, what it does, how it behaves. It's pretty freaking cool, actually, if you can get through it, which it's not an easy thing to do, but then again, things that are worth it won't be easy.
Idealist mathematical monism, which is a dual aspect monism, can account for mind and matter. Science cannot do this. They cannot explain consciousness, mind, or subjectivity, or sentience, or any of these aspects because they are on faulty premises. Similarly, they cannot provide answers to the apparent mysteries of quantum mechanics, such as superposition, and they introduce all these absurdities to try and get away with it.
Superposition isn't mysterious, though.
Such as, particles existing everywhere at once, or the
which is not what superposition says.
Multiverse, all these crazy, absurd, fallacious ideas.
The Everettian Foundation doesn't actually posit a multiverse. It posits multiple different timelines through which the one universe evolves.
Because, again, mind is outside of their paradigm. As soon as you introduce mind, all the mysteries of quantum mechanics melt away. You don't have particles that have to be everywhere at once. You don't have to have particles that exist in an infinite number of universe. They're simple particles that are acting out their inner mathematical trajectories based on their inner mentality. Not that they're subjectivities, but that they are thought complexes that are still controlled by mental processes, not their own personal subjective mental processes. That would be some weird form of panpsychism. But by just the mental properties that would govern thought in general. So, I hope that I have, made it very, very clear how the monumental absurdity of scientific materialism. It's just to the point where I can't even read.
You haven't. I'm sorry, but no, you have not. You definitely have not.
These crazy claims. I just want, it's just
today, Junior.
It's just a joke. If the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, then although we know the conscious mind is nothing more than the brain, it's simply beyond how we can know there's nothing more than the brain. How do we know that? Well, we don't actually. All that we know is just we know it, but we don't know it. So how can we know it? We don't know, but we do. I hope that I have at least elucidated the immense absurdities
of your position. Yes, you have. Yes, that is exactly what you have done. I mean, unequivocally, because there is nothing absurd about a naturalist or a physicalist perspective, especially when it comes to the mind. Like I said, several minutes ago, I think a physicalist perspective has a substantially higher prior probability than any sort of non-physicalist perspective when it comes to the mind, just by the very intuitive nature of how the mind works and how it's connected to consciousness. So, yeah, you haven't really attacked the position, at least not substantively, and certainly haven't provided substantive arguments for your own.
That come with dogmatically claiming that reality is material. And the fact that it cannot be explained is not some controversial idea. It's established almost consensus that scientific materialism cannot explain these things. They can't. It's known.
That's not established consensus. And scientific materialism explains most aspects of human cognition.
And that's not controversial. It can't. It's unknown how it can be. And that the founders of quantum mechanics said that reality is not material. That
no, they didn't.
It's ultimately mind, or
no, they fucking didn't.
Or mathematics, depending on or mathematical mind, whether it's Planck or Schrodinger or Heisenberg.
None of them said that.
And that once you introduce mind into the equation in an idealist mathematical rationalist system, all the mysteries melt away, and you don't have to claim all these absurd positions. So if you want to know more about this, check out my other videos, check out my books, check out my works, all these different things to get a better understanding. But yeah, quantum mechanics, consciousness, not such a hard problem after all. It's actually quite a elegant and beautiful thing that both rest on the commonality of mind. Science can't explain this because they try to deny mind, so of course they won't be able to explain it. It's just, this is like logic 101. I mean, come on, guys, please. So
logic 101.
Hey, let's stop living in the intellectual dark ages, and hey, make your choice. What do you want to go with, right? Do you want to go with like religious faith? Do you want to go with dogmatic materialist empirical scientism? Or do you want to go with reason? I mean, it's up to you. You can choose what you want, or you can just not believe anything. But that in itself is a choice. I mean, you at the end of the day, you choose what you want to choose. I'm laying out reasons to you, and make a choice. We as Hyperions are those that choose reason. So step with us into the future. Get out of the dark ages. Yeah, if you want, you don't have to, but it's here for you. Examine it with logic and reason. Make your own decision, and we'll be here building a new world and creating a new future. I want to give a big shout out to.
Okay. So, no, Danny, I will never become a dualist because it doesn't provide any reasonable mechanistic explanations for what consciousness is. Sorry. When you actually have something that tells me something about consciousness and what it is and how it works and why it is a thing extended through reality, then I might adhere to your model, but it doesn't do that yet. Anyway, final thoughts. No argument. I really did not hear anything in terms of an argument for this Hyperionism, that this interestingly vacuous position, it seems. So it seems all I really heard were sort of these attacks that science can't explain it. Science is paradigms of science aren't sufficient for explaining this because they exclude all the things you need to explain it. I didn't really see much in the way of backing that up. Again, it was kind of just bloviating about a bunch of quantum woo as it relates to consciousness without offering anything substantive in in the way of supporting the actual position. Whereas, like I said, you give me 15 or 20 minutes and I could probably lay out a pretty substantive case for a physicalist perspective as it comes to the mind that rests not just on merely philosophical argumentation, but on empirical literature as well. As well as relying on a large body of professionals, a consensus in both the neuroscience and the philosophy, both of which largely favor my perspective. So, yeah, there is another video that Morgue did mention at the beginning of this one we just reviewed, where Jesus Christ, where he goes over science and explains why he thinks science doesn't actually explain things and stuff like that. So I am probably going to do a review of that because that one looked pretty interesting. But as for this video, it is done and over with. So until next time, my beautiful cubs, through reason we progress.